Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is slightly different than some of the webinars that we normally run. We're using only 30 minutes today over lunchtime. It's summer, so it's quite a quiet season, but again, a recording will be available and we'll be doing more presentations on this research on this topic over the coming months. But thank you very much for joining us to talk about buildings. We've wanted to do a paper like this on the built environment for some time now. Buildings might not be the first sector that you think of when you think about the sectors of the economy that are driving climate change. But buildings is a very important one. There are lots of them. We need lots of energy to light, heat, cool, and power buildings. The construction of buildings is very energy and carbon intensive as well. And all in the construction and operation of buildings accounts for about 30% of global emissions. This is not uniformly distributed. This is a chart showing energy demand instead, and you can see big growth in energy consumption from buildings in Asia, but there is lots of work to do across the world to bring the building sector in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and with the ultimate goal of net zero emissions. We need emissions from the built environment to be falling, but they have increased in the 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. So there is much more work to do. And we have the tools to reduce these emissions. We're not going to talk too much today about the nuts and bolts of how we decarbonize buildings. There is lots of material online available for you to read if you're interested in that. But it's important to acknowledge that in terms of the emissions from operating buildings, there are things that we can do now, and many of these technologies are not only viable and readily available, but widely deployed. We can make buildings more energy efficient, using things like smart heating technologies and improving insulation. Some of you might already be doing this in the homes that you live in. We can electrify appliances, heating and cooking. We can procure more renewable energy, either installing it in buildings or on buildings, or procuring it offsite. Embodied carbon is a bigger challenge, and we acknowledge this in the report, but there are also things that we can do here. We can make efficiency savings in embodied carbon. That's the emissions from the construction of buildings. In terms of how we design them, we can use alternative building materials. And there's also important advances in the decarbonisation of heavy industry in the construction supply chain that can bring down the emissions of raw materials like steel. Now, as part of this conversation, we need to talk about investors because real estate is a very big asset class. So we're talking about investors who buy, lease, and sell buildings or finance the development of buildings in order to generate a financial return. The investment universe for real estate is very big. The professionally managed real estate market, that's talking about buildings that are leased by or bought, held, sold developments by professional investment managers. That represents about 13 trillion US dollars. So it's a very large market. There are lots of different ways that real estate investors can get exposure. So institutional investors can buy buildings themselves, and they can operate their real estate investments directly. But they can also commonly give the responsibility for doing that to an investment manager, like the investment managers that we look at in the report that we've just published. So when we were thinking about where to begin looking at real estate as an asset class, we decided to narrow it down in a couple of ways. So first, we're just looking at the investment managers and their direct investments in buildings. There's a couple of reasons for this, but foremost is that these investment managers steward capital on behalf of very many institutional investors, and the decisions that they make and the investment policies that they have very widespread consequences in the built environment. The second choice that we made in thinking about where to start looking at this sector is that we selected a sample of 16 investment managers that are among the largest in the world. So you can see those circles on the left-hand side of the screen. Within the professionally managed real estate market, you've got about 150 investment managers that manage around 46% of that market. And then the 16 investors we look at sit within that. All in, they manage assets equivalent to the market value of the New York real estate market today. So a very large volume of emissions and buildings and the decisions that they make have very real consequences for the decarbonisation of the built environment and, of course, the people who are living and working in those buildings. So when we set out to do this report, we set out to create a comparative assessment of their policies on climate change, and also we looked at how they're considering the just transition as a theme in their investment policies, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But briefly, in terms of how we selected those 16 managers, so when we looked at the list of the biggest investment managers in the world, the first thing we did is we screened out investment managers or their parents that appear in our other reports. And I just want to quickly highlight the brilliant work that my colleagues at ShareAction do in our financial sector standards directorate. So we publish benchmarks of insurers, of banks, and a benchmark of 77 of the largest asset managers, 76, sorry, of the largest asset managers in the world. And these rankings include very many large real estate investors. And so we'd very much encourage you to read those reports. Point of No Returns 2025 came out in May and covers very many themes beyond climate change. But we wanted to look specifically at real estate as an asset class, given its significant contribution to global emissions. And so here we're looking at particularly managers that specialize in real estate and have very large direct real estate investments. It's a global sample, so we took 8 of the largest North American managers, and then we capped that number at half the list because North America represents a very large number of the largest real estate investment managers, and we wanted to get a sample of managers operating in other jurisdictions as well. So we then took the 6 largest European and 2 of the largest Asian managers. In terms of the process that we followed, we selected the peer group and then we reached out to them to let them know that we'd be doing this research. And we designed a questionnaire to gather data on their investment policies as relates to climate change. We then, once we collected that data, we shared it with all the investment managers and we gave them a month to verify it for accuracy and also to supplement our findings if there's anything that we'd missed or anything that they wanted to tell us privately, information that was non-public to give a bit more context to their disclosures. We then analysed these findings and produced the assessment that we published last week, which was shared with the investment managers. A summary of the assessment was shared with investment managers in June, with a further invitation to check our findings for accuracy and notify us of any corrections that we needed to make. The assessment is based on 12 key standards for responsible climate action, and these cover 3 themes. So the first is target setting. We looked at their short and long-term commitments to address and reduce their emissions, covering both the operation of their buildings and the construction. We looked at their targets as relate to energy efficiency, which, as I've said, is another critical area to consider in the built environment and its pathway to net zero. And I'll talk more about energy efficiency targets in a moment. We set 4 further standards on strategy. So we looked at whether the investment managers are assessing climate-related risks to their investments. We looked at whether they describe having a systematic approach to creating decarbonisation plans for their assets in order to decarbonise their portfolios. We looked at whether they have commitments to halt the installation of fossil fuel infrastructure, which is aligned with the new buildings guidance from the Science Based Targets Initiative. And we also looked at whether they have a policy just to measure the emissions from their new developments, so producing whole life carbon assessments. As I say, reducing embodied carbon is a real challenge, but at least by measuring it, you can look for the embodied carbon hotspots and think about how it should be reduced. And lastly, we looked at disclosures and how transparent investment managers are about the scale of their contribution to climate change. And also their progress in reducing their emissions. We think it's important that managers are transparent and that they disclose material information publicly, and that if they're setting climate targets, as we encourage them to do, they should also be disclosing their emissions so that we can see how those emissions are trending. Managers were graded A to F based on how many of these key standards they achieve. And then within grade bands, we further rank them by score. So some of the information we collected, some of the questions in our survey were scored as related to the achievement of the key standards. So a higher score basically equates to better alignment or overachieving the key standards. And that gives a bit more context within grade bands for how investment managers performed in our assessment. So now I'm going to take you through some of the headline findings of the assessment. I'm not going to talk through these in too much detail, but I'm going to take you through the key findings. And then for more information and for more discussion, more commentary, you can find that in the report that we've produced. So first on climate targets, and this covers the first five key standards. The headline finding is that climate targets that these investment managers have set are undermined in large part by the exclusion of material scope 3 emissions. So as we note in the report, very many of these managers, particularly at the top of the ranking table, have set science-based targets in the short and long term. So you can see that the first managers ranked A to C have all disclosed the net zero commitment that includes their emissions as landlord, but also the scope 3 emissions of their tenants from tenant energy demand. We think it's really important that these emissions are included in the scope of net zero commitments, and that's aligned with recommendations from third parties as well. These emissions are material, scope 3 emissions, depending on the type of the building we're talking about, do constitute or can constitute a very large share of emissions from buildings that these investment managers hold. So on that basis, they should be included. But also it's to reflect the shared responsibility for reducing these emissions. Tenant energy emissions, or emissions from tenant energy use, are a product of how tenants behave and sometimes their energy procurement policies, which may be out of the control of investment managers. But it's also a product of the quality of the building that is leased to them, the energy efficiency of that building, and of how closely tenants and landlords are cooperating to reduce these emissions. And reflecting this, several of the investment managers we include in the report and have assessed have included these emissions in their commitments. There was less progress to target or explicitly to target embodied carbon emissions. That's the emissions again from the construction, the upfront emissions from the construction of buildings. So only five investment managers in the report explicitly included this in the scope of the commitment. So overall, although 13 of the managers disclosed some kind of commitment, only five of these covered both full life cycle operational and embodied carbon emissions. This is also a good moment to note a lack of transparency or vagueness in some disclosures, which created challenges when we were producing this report because it wasn't always clear from managers' public disclosures what their commitments covered. And in some cases where investment managers had targeted or committed to target material scope 3 emissions to the extent possible, they told us privately that actually tenant emissions and embodied emissions weren't included in that commitment. When it came to interim targets, we found that four managers that had net zero commitments hadn't disclosed an interim target. This included a couple of managers that had committed to disclose them in the future. Some managers also spoke about their efforts to reduce their emissions in vague terms that didn't meet our criteria when it came to standard settings. So that's being measurable, specific, time-bound, and portfolio-wide managers like Blackstone and Premier REIT. The other key finding from interim targets is that managers weren't always clear what proportion of their AUM was being managed in line with net zero and so covered by their targets. This included targets that were disclosed as part of managers' commitments to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is now suspended pending a review. So it's important that we see what will happen to those targets in the future and that they're not forgotten about or diluted. Energy efficiency. So energy efficiency, as I've said already, is really important metric for transition in the built environment. We need to reduce energy demand across the economy as much as we can, particularly so we can free it up for energy for other places and reduce strain on the grid. There are divergent possible futures when it comes to energy consumption in buildings. Under business as use scenarios, energy use could grow 50 or 60%, but also we see that in pathways to net zero emissions that align with the Paris Agreement, energy demand from buildings decreases even as demand for space heating and cooling grows. We found only four managers that had disclosed portfolio-wide whole building commitments to improve energy efficiency. So that's considering energy use by both landlords and tenants. A small number of other managers disclosed commitments to improve energy efficiency for specific funds or regions, and sometimes these only covered landlord energy use. As I said when we were going through the key standards, we think it's important that investment managers disclose climate targets. They should also be transparent about their emissions. But we found that six managers didn't disclose their portfolio emissions beyond some limited emissions that appeared related to their corporate activities or perhaps their corporate offices. So there was a significant disclosure gap at the bottom of our ranking. This did affect the grading and the ranking of certain managers who otherwise did show commitment to climate action in their investment practices. And we think this is an area where significant improvement could be made in our assessment. Now, briefly onto strategy. It's difficult to benchmark investment managers on their plans to meet their climate targets. And I've gone through the four standards that we used that form the basis for our assessment. So to start with what most managers did disclose in their public reporting. And again, as a reminder, we could only assess what we could see, publicly available information, and what investment managers told us to give us greater context. So most managers did identify at least one relevant decarbonisation lever in their disclosures that were relevant for them to reduce their emissions or improve energy efficiency. And many managers also provided useful case studies of assets or funds where these levers were being put into practice. Many investment managers talk about their certifications for green buildings or funds. And while this can be positive and these assessments can be very useful, they do not necessarily track with alignment with the Paris Agreement and specifically the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And lastly, investment managers did report consistently that they are using scenario analysis to assess risks. They didn't always disclose the scenarios that they used to do this, and this had an impact on our assessment, but all of them report that they are assessing their resilience of their portfolios against at least physical risk. All but one manager reported that they had used scenario analysis to assess transition risk. But there were also important gaps in their disclosures that made it quite hard to understand how managers intend to deliver on their targets. So most managers, although they identify relevant decarbonisation levers, they don't quantify at portfolio level the contribution that those levers will make to the achievement of their targets, at least in their public reporting. Some investment managers indicated to us that they are providing this information to investors in specific funds privately. So we found only two managers that had disclosed some kind of quantified roadmap in the last couple of years. Most managers, that's 9, I believe, of the managers we assessed, didn't meet our criteria for describing a systematic approach to decarbonising their portfolios. So we looked at, do managers describe assessing buildings to determine whether emissions reductions need to be made and how they will do them? Are these emissions reductions in service of a whole building emissions target? So that's both landlord and tenant emissions. And also, are the plans costed? So we looked through their public disclosures to work out which managers met these criteria, and only 7 of them did. Further than that, I think only 3 of the managers that we looked at in the report actually quantified their progress in terms of making these plans. So some managers disclosed the number of buildings that they'd made these plans for, or the proportion of their portfolio assets that they'd made these plans for. In terms of the other 2 key standards in our assessment that related to strategy, only one manager, that's NREP, had a watertight commitment to stop installing fossil fuel infrastructure that aligned with the criteria of the Science Based Targets Initiative building standard. That standard was released quite recently, and NREP was one of the first firms to submit its targets for verification and approval under that guidance. A small number of managers, I believe 4, reported that in every new development, they produce a whole life carbon assessment to identify embodied carbon hotspots for reduction. Several other investment managers said they do produce these assessments, but it wasn't always clear how frequently they did this or whether this was a routine policy across the developments that they do or finance. For example, some said that they would only produce them for assets over a certain value. I'm going to finish now on the ranking table. I wanted to finish here, not start here, as it brings all of the findings together and gives a bit more of a holistic view of how managers performed. As I say, several of the investment managers we assessed in this report show their commitment to climate action today. They've set science-based targets. They describe making plans to meet them, and they're transparent about their emissions and the climate risks that they face. At the same time, around half of the managers met fewer than half of our key standards, and 3 investment managers at the bottom of our report didn't meet any of those key standards. The standards were ambitious, but they were attainable. Each standard was achieved by at least one investment manager. I'd also note here that it was possible to get an A in our assessment without meeting every key standard. In fact, there's an investment manager in the top of the ranking who got B without having a net zero commitment. So it might be the case that some of these standards are more difficult than others to achieve, but you didn't necessarily need to achieve all of them in order to get top marks in our assessment. And we would encourage investment managers to review themselves against these standards. For the investment managers that we have assessed in this report, to look at this table and see how they compare to their peers. And we'd also encourage their clients, asset owners, to do the same. I'm now briefly going to talk about the second part of our report, which was equally as important, on the just transition in the built environment. This was a theme that we wanted to go deeper on for a few reasons. The first is that investments in the built environment can create positive social outcomes, but if buildings are treated solely as financial assets, there is a clear risk of tension between human welfare and the expectation of financial return. Of course, the degree of risk depends on the assets in question and their impacts on tenants and local communities. The right to adequate housing is a human right under international law, and of course, the risks are very acute there. Inequalities of wealth, power, and spatial accesses exist in the built environment today. Many are not afforded their human right to affordable housing today. And that's the context that we are operating in, that we are talking about when we're talking about transition in the built environment. And then comes decarbonisation, which will have social consequences for better or worse. And it may be an opportunity to address some of these issues. At the same time, if they're not considered in the process of transition planning, some of these negative impacts may be exacerbated. According to the Institute for Human Rights and Business, whose resources we relied on heavily when we were producing this part of the report, a just transition in all sectors, but particularly the built environment in this case, means preventing risks and adverse impacts through human rights due diligence, equal access to opportunities and benefits for people affected by the transition, in this case, tenants and local communities and workers in the building supply chain, accountability to and the agency of potentially affected groups who are included and actively engaged in the process of decision making, and transformational systems change. So IHRB explain, a just transition cannot simply replace an extractive carbon economy with a system of green extraction where fundamental power relations remain unchanged. We did not have space in this report to do any kind of comprehensive assessment of how these investment managers are approaching the just transition. And instead, for this, our first benchmark on the sector, we decided to look in detail at two areas. So we wanted to look at human rights due diligence as relates to the supply chains of these investment managers, but also to their own decision making as relates to decarbonisation. So how are they considering the social risks and opportunities that they are creating through their transition planning? And secondly, accountability and agency for potentially affected groups. So how are these investment managers reporting that they engage with the tenants and communities that live and work in their buildings and that their operations have an effect on? So we asked three questions when we were looking through their public disclosures. Do they have policies to assess, the impact of decisions related to decarbonisation? Do they engage with tenants and communities about those potential impacts, and do they involve them in decision making? And do they have policies on covering their supply chains to protect against abuses, both of workers and human rights violations? And there's an important caveat here, which is that it's difficult to assess these issues, particularly by looking at public disclosures made by these investment managers. We could only assess the policies that they reported having publicly. We couldn't assess whether and how they were being implemented, and we didn't talk to any of the communities and tenants that may be affected by the operations of their investment managers to get their perspective. So I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations of our findings and of our research methods. At the same time, we think that the findings from the report are useful for investment managers considering the just transition in their investment approaches, and also asset owners that might be looking to engage with their investment managers on this topic. So in public reporting, we found very little evidence that investment managers are doing human rights due diligence when they make decisions related to decarbonisation. Some investment managers reported to us that they were, but the low response rate and the lack of public evidence makes it very difficult to make further inference from that limited finding. Managers did report various forms of engagement with tenants and communities through their operations. However, we found very little reference to engagement specifically around decarbonisation. And also, managers generally didn't describe decision-making processes that might seek to include or give agency to the communities in question. That is a really fundamental issue here, as IHRB have explained, and we'd like to see that better articulated by these investment managers. There were better policies as related to workers' rights and supply chain due diligence. So several investment managers did have policies that were aligned with international frameworks on workers' rights and on protecting against actual or potential human rights abuses. But there was much room for improvement here, and several managers, again, did not disclose those policies. So with a couple of minutes left, thank you for sitting through our very brief research bulletin today, and we hope that you found it interesting and useful. And just to talk a bit about what we are doing next. So having published the report, we're going to be having several follow-up meetings with the investment managers that we looked at in this report to understand their perspective on the assessment and to talk to them about what we found. We'll also be talking to institutional investors who are interested to discuss our findings. So if you are an asset owner and you perhaps are a client of some of these investment managers or another investment manager that this research might have relevance to, please do get in touch with us. We'd be happy to talk to you. And I've left our email on the screen. That's realestate@shareaction.org. We will be following up on this assessment in the future, though our plans to do that are not fully formed at this stage.